There is a gap in human history. 295,000 years where people lived, built, believed, and died, and left no written record. We used to call that gap prehistory. We used to call it primitive. We were wrong. This is civilizations before writing.
12,000 years ago, people were building places just to think, not to eat, not to sleep, not to survive, just to ask questions about what they were. 3 sites, thousands of years apart, same obsession. This is what was happening before writing.
Okay, so you heard of Göbekli Tepe, right? The ancient site in Turkey that everybody's talking about. There's another site 46 kilometers away that's possibly even older. And what they found inside is, I don't even know how to explain it. So I'm gonna let the story speak for itself. This is Karahan Tepe.
Southeastern Turkey, a limestone hillside, 11,000 years ago. The people who came here had no farming, no pottery, no metal tools, no permanent homes. They were hunter-gatherers, and somehow they carved an entire complex into solid bedrock. Not just pillars, though there are over 250 of those documented, many still standing today, but full rooms, chambers cut directly from living rock, stairs carved downward into spaces underground. Someone planned those stairs, decided where they'd go, decided what they'd lead to. What separates Karahan Tepe from other ancient sites is how deliberate everything feels. Not grand public spaces built for crowds. Smaller, more intimate, like whatever was happening here wasn't meant for everyone. Like it was meant for a specific few, for specific reasons. In 2022, excavators opened one of those chambers, and what they found inside has been puzzling researchers ever since. In the floor of the room, carved directly from bedrock, 11 phalluses standing upright, each one roughly 6 feet tall, about the height of a full-grown man. All 11 of them packed into a room that is only 20 feet by 23 feet total, smaller than most living rooms. And above them, emerging from the wall at the top of the room, a bearded human head with a serpent's body, watching over everything below it. We don't know exactly what this room was for, but whoever built it thought very carefully about every single detail, the size, the number, the figure on the wall, the room itself. Nothing in here is accidental. In 2023, excavators found something else. A statue, seated, carved with extraordinary detail. Ribs visible, fingers articulated, a V-shaped collar around the neck, 7.5 feet tall. The skim involved is hard to overstate. The anatomy is studied, deliberate, almost uncomfortable in how realistic it is. Older than Egypt, older than Mesopotamia, older than anything we normally point to when we talk about the beginning of human art. Made by people who, by every standard definition, shouldn't have been capable of this yet. No settled society to free up artists, no surplus food to support specialists, no cities to organize the labor. Just a need, a belief, something that had to be made. These people weren't only looking inward, they were looking up. At Karahan Tepe, there is what researchers call a porthole stone, a carved circular opening in a wall. It aligns with Deneb, the brightest star in the constellation Cygnus. The site also appears to track the winter solstice sunrise. Think about what that requires. No calendar, no writing, no instruments, just years of watching, generations of knowledge passed down by memory. Enough precision to position a stone opening so that one specific star shines through it on one specific night of the year. Whether you call that science or religion or both, it is sophisticated, it is intentional, And it was happening 11,000 years ago, before any civilization we normally talk about existed. And in 2024, something else came out of the ground here. A small carving of a donkey, detailed, in proportion, mid-stride. It seems simple until you realize donkeys weren't domesticated yet, not for another 4,000 to 6,000 years. The person who carved this had never seen a tame donkey. Nobody alive had. This was a completely wild animal. Why did they carve it? We don't know. A hunting record? A spiritual symbol? Something that meant something specific to these people? We can't answer that, but they knew that animal well enough to capture it accurately in stone. They observed it, they studied it, and then they made it permanent for reasons that made complete sense to them and that we may never fully understand.
And they found all of this, the statue, the chambers, the sky alignment, the donkey, from 5% of the site. 5%. There's 95% still underground.
At some point around 8000 BCE, the people who used Karahan Tepe stopped, and they didn't just leave. They buried it. Deliberately, carefully, tons of fill dirt and rubble sealing everything inside. The same thing happened at Göbekli Tepe nearby, a pattern, not an accident. Whatever was here, they chose to preserve it by hiding it, or to end it, or both. We don't know which. What we do know is that it worked. The chambers survived, the statue survived, the pillars survived, the donkey survived. Sealed underground 11,000 years until someone with a brush and a trowel opened it back up. These people left no name, no language we can trace, no written word of any kind. Just stone, carefully carved, deliberately placed, then deliberately buried. A message with no words. And somehow, 11,000 years later, we found it.
This is Karahan Tepe. And again, only 5% excavated. I don't know what's down there. Nobody does. Next episode, we go to the Natufians. The first people in human history who decided to stop moving and stay somewhere. Build a home.
So that's the site with no farming, no cities, no writing. Just stone, carvings, and something that looks a lot like religion. Now move forward a few thousand years. Different people, different place. Same thing started to happen. Before farming, before cities, before writing, there were people who figured it out. You don't have to move. This is their story.
15,000 years ago, there were no countries, no borders, no kings, no gods written down in books. Just people, moving, always moving. Follow the herds, follow the seasons, follow the food. That was the deal. That was life. And then, somewhere in what is now Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, a group of people looked at each other and said, "Why? Why keep walking?" We call them the Natufians. They didn't call themselves that. We have no idea what they called themselves. We don't have their language. We don't have their name for the mountains they lived in, or the rivers they drank from, or the people they loved. What we have is what the ground kept. And the ground kept a lot. Roughly 15,000 to 11,500 years ago, the Natufians lived across a stretch of land archaeologists call the Levantine Corridor, the eastern Mediterranean coast, the Jordan Valley, the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. This region at the time was not desert, It was green, lush, thick with wild wheat, wild barley, wild gazelle. The kind of landscape that made a hunter-gatherer stop and think, maybe I don't need to leave. And they didn't. For the first time in human history, at scale, people built permanent settlements. Not caves, not seasonal camps. Villages, stone foundations, circular houses half dug into the earth, cool in summer, warm in winter. Storage pits. They ground wild grain with stone mortars. We found the mortars. We found the wear patterns on their teeth from eating grit-heavy bread. These were not primitive people fumbling towards civilization. These were people who figured something out. The site of Ain Malaha in northern Israel may have housed up to 200 people at its peak. 200 people living together, season after season, year after year. That doesn't sound like much until you realize that no human community had ever done that before. Not consistently, not permanently. The Natufians didn't invent farming. They were still hunting, still gathering, still reading the landscape like a book, but they stopped running from it. Here is something the Natufians did that will stay with you. They buried their dead under the floor of the house. Not outside, not in a separate place. Under the floor, where they walked, where they slept, where they cooked and argued and raised children. The dead stayed home. We found hundreds of Natufian burials. Some are decorated, shells, animal teeth, carved bone, signs of status, signs of ceremony. Some are buried alone. Some are buried together. At Ain Malaha, archaeologists found an elderly woman buried with her hand resting on a puppy. A dog, a small dog placed beside her with intention. That burial is 12,000 years old, and it is the oldest known evidence of the human-dog bond anywhere on Earth. She took her dog with her. Whoever buried her made sure of it. The Natufians carved animals into stone and bone, gazelles, tortoises, geometric patterns we haven't fully decoded. They wore jewelry, headbands of shells, necklaces of animal teeth, bracelets. They held feasts. We know because we found the bones. Massive communal meals, the kind of gathering that takes coordination, planning, social structure. These were not isolated families scratching out survival. This was culture.
So they built villages, they buried their dead, they kept dogs, and then something hit them, something they couldn't fight.
Around 12,900 years ago, the world broke. A period called the Younger Dryas hit the planet like a switch being flipped. Temperatures dropped fast. The rains stopped. The green Levant began to dry. The wild grain fields thinned. The gazelle herds moved on. Everything the Natufians had built their world around started disappearing. Some Natufian communities abandoned their villages and went back to moving, back to following the food. But some did something else entirely. Some looked at the dying landscape, at the shrinking wild grain, and made a decision that would change the entire trajectory of human history. If the plants won't grow on their own, we'll make them grow. They started farming, not because it was easier. Early farming was brutal, backbreaking. The skeletons of early farmers show more disease, more malnutrition, more spinal damage than the hunter-gatherers before them. They did it because the alternative was extinction. The Natufians didn't survive as a culture. The world they built dissolved into migration, into crisis, into the first trembling experiments with agriculture. But their DNA didn't disappear. Their descendants became the first farmers of the Near East, the people who would eventually build Jericho, Çatalhöyük, and Göbekli Tepe, the ancestors of civilization. They were the last people who lived before all of that. And they buried their dogs under the floor, and wore shells around their necks, and ground grain in the dark, and had no idea what was coming. Neither did we, until we dug them up.
The Natufians didn't survive what came next, but what came after them, that's where civilization began. Next episode, we go there.
They were settling down, building permanent places, and the first thing they did with that permanence wasn't store food, it was make figures and bury them under the floor. One more site and it gets even stranger. 9,000 years ago, in what is now Jordan, someone built something and then buried it. Not because it was trash, but because it mattered. This is Ain Ghazal, and nobody fully understands what they found there.
In 1974, construction workers building a highway outside Amman, Jordan, cut into a hillside and exposed the edge of something nobody expected to find, a city 9,000 years old. They called it Ain Ghazal. In Arabic, it means Spring of the Gazelle. At its peak, it held somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 people, making it one of the largest known settlements in the entire Near East during that era, 3 to 4 times the size of Jericho at the same moment in time. One archaeologist called it the Manhattan of the Neolithic, and it had been sitting under a modern road. Ain Ghazal sits on a hillside at the edge of modern Amman, near the point where the Sil Amman stream meets the Zarqa River. In the Neolithic, this was a fertile zone between Oak Park woodland to the west and open steppe to the east, a good place to build. The site was occupied from around 7250 BCE to roughly 5000 BCE. That is over 2,000 years of continuous use. The people who lived there were not nomads passing through. They built rectangular multi-room houses from stone and plaster. They plastered their floors. They buried their dead beneath the ground, inside the settlement, sometimes under the floors of the same houses they lived in. They farmed wheat, barley, lentils, chickpeas. They herded goats. They hunted gazelle and deer. They traded. Bitumen from the Dead Sea appears at the site, along with materials from outside the immediate region, which tells us they were connected to a broader network. These were not primitive people scrambling to survive. They were organized. They were building something. Before we get to the statues, we need to talk about the skulls. Archaeologists at Ain Ghazal uncovered 6 plastered human skulls. This was not unique to Ain Ghazal. Plastered skulls have been found at other sites in the region, including Jericho, going back even further into the 8th millennium BCE. It appears to have been a widespread practice across this part of the ancient Levant. Here is what was done. After a person died, the skull was separated, the lower jaw removed. The remaining skull was then covered with lime plaster, and the features, forehead, brows, nose, mouth, chin, were carefully modeled back into something that looked like a face. In some cases, eyes were recreated using shell or paint. These were not trophies. The attention to individual features suggests something more deliberate, some kind of relationship with the dead person being maintained. What that relationship was and what these skulls were used for, ritual, ceremony, ancestor veneration, archaeologists debate. What is not debated is that the people of Ain Ghazal were doing something intentional with the faces of their dead, something that cost time and effort and care. In 1983, archaeologists working at Ain Ghazal spotted something at the edge of a cross-section of soil cut by a bulldozer. About 2.5 meters underground, 8 feet down, there was a pit, and in the pit were statues. The excavation was led by archaeologist Gary Rolofson. What they found shocked the field. The first cache contained 25 pieces, full standing figures and busts. They were made from bundled reeds and twigs wrapped and layered in lime plaster. The faces had been given wide, staring eyes, white plaster with pupils made of bitumen brought from the Dead Sea. The figures ranged from about 35 centimeters to roughly a meter in height. Some figures bore traces of painted clothing or body paint. Some figures had what appeared to be arms, withered and small, positioned against the torso. Radiocarbon dating placed them at approximately 6750 BCE. The 1983 cache was carefully removed and sent to the Institute of Archaeology in London for conservation. 2 years later, in 1985, a second cache was found. This one was transported in one piece, the entire pit block-lifted and shipped to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, where it was excavated under laboratory conditions. The second cache added another 7 statues and a single head. But the second group was different from the first in notable ways. The faces were more angular, the eyes more exaggerated, and several of the torsos had been deliberately made wide enough to carry 2 heads, 2-headed busts. The first cache had none. The 2 caches are dated roughly 200 years apart. Someone made these statues, and then 2 centuries later, someone else, or perhaps descendants, made more, different but related. In total, 32 figures, buried in pits beneath the floors of abandoned houses, oriented roughly east to west, carefully laid in. They were not thrown away, they were placed.
So here's what's wild to me. These people, 9,000 years ago, 9,000 years ago, they're working lime plaster onto human skulls to keep the faces of the dead looking like faces. And then a few hundred years later, they start building full-size human figurines out of the same material. And they buried those too. Whatever they believed in had to do something with holding on.
Here is the honest state of what we know. Academic researchers have put forward 3 main interpretations of Ain Ghazal's statues. They may represent ancestors, an extension of the plastered skull tradition, transforming the practice of honoring the dead into something more permanent and elaborate. They may represent deities or supernatural figures, beings that existed somewhere outside the human world. Or they may have been ritual objects in a more active sense, created for a ceremony, used in some way, and then deliberately retired, buried as part of the ritual itself. The fact that they were buried so shortly after being made, possibly almost immediately, is one of the most puzzling details. Some researchers have suggested they may have been made with the intention of burying them, as if the making and the burying were both part of the same act. None of these interpretations is settled. The 2-headed figures add another layer of uncertainty. No one has a convincing explanation for what 2 heads signified to the people who made them. What can be said is this: the statues fit into a pattern visible across the broader ancient Levant during this period. Similar figures have been found at other sites. Similar symbolic systems appear to have been shared across a wide region. Ain Ghazal was not doing something entirely isolated. It was participating in something larger, a shared language of the dead or the sacred that we can see the outline of but cannot read. Ain Ghazal reached its peak around 7000 BCE. 3,000 to 4,000 people, houses, ritual buildings, trade connections, a functioning city in the highlands of Jordan. And then it collapsed. After around 6900 BCE, the population dropped by approximately 90%. Not a slow decline, a near evacuation. The cause appears to have been environmental degradation, and the evidence points to the community's own activity as a significant factor. Lime plaster production, which the people of Ain Ghazal used extensively for floors, for walls, for statues, for skulls, requires burning enormous quantities of wood, thousands of trees. The forests around the site were cleared, not just for plaster production, but for agriculture, for fuel, for grazing land. The landscape that had made Ain Ghazal viable was consumed by Ain Ghazal. Combined with what appears to have been a significant drop in rainfall around this time, the land stopped supporting the population. Subsequent research found evidence that former inhabitants migrated into what is now the Black Desert, a landscape that, in Neolithic times, was wetter and more inhabitable than it is today. The city did not simply end. The people scattered. They took their knowledge with them and adapted. But the city itself was abandoned, and the land that had once fed thousands of people did not recover in any time frame that mattered to the people who left it.
What gets me about Ain Ghazal is the statues outlasted everything. The city's gone, the forest that fed it, gone, the people scattered, but those statues buried under the floor, they were still there 9,000 years later. Ain Ghazal, the spring of the gazelle, the water's still there. The rest of it, well, we're still trying to figure it out. Until next time, keep an open mind. Three sites: Karahan Tepe, hunter-gatherers carving temples into rocks. The Natufians settling down and immediately going ritual. Ain Ghazal, burying human figures before they even had the word for what they were doing. Nobody told them to connect these dots, but the dots are there. Symbolism didn't come after civilization, it came first. Maybe it is civilization.